This is Generous Theology. Today, Chuck and Brock examine a seminal psalm, a psalm that declares some of the most sublime truths straight from God's own heart, Psalm 19.
No, that's great. Chariots of Fire is, I saw that as a kid, maybe you did too, and it was a movie that had a great deal of impact on me. And I like that reference that you made. And the psalmist uses those kinds of images throughout the Psalms, but here as well. Yeah, the champion rejoicing to run his course, and like a bridegroom coming forth from his pavilion, and you have this picture of the sun, right? And this is an ode a little bit to the sun, but unlike the other religions of the Near East of the time of the psalmist, the sun, the ode to the sun is not being sung because the sun is some kind of a god, but rather the sun is the servant of God, a servant of God who is rejoicing to do his work, which is bringing glory to God and making its circuit from one end of the heavens to the other, like a champion rejoicing to run its course. And so you get this idea of the sun, which is this amazingly strong thing. It brings about life. We have to have the sun to live, and yet it is God's creation. It is God's servant. It is God's creature, and God is making his presence known through his creature, the sun. And the sun was pictured as being joyful in being able to do that in order to, through the sun, to bring the glory of God to the earth. And so the heavens, the sun, for example, is telling the glory of God, and in doing so, the sun rejoices because it gets to do that great job. It gets to bring glory to God. And of course, using the sun for this image just shows how great and glorious God is as well. Because how much more glorious and great must God be if he is the creator of the sun, if he is the one who puts the sun in its course, the one who tells the sun, this is your job that you're going to do day after day. And then the sun rejoices to be able to do that job. That's just, it is an amazing image. A couple other things that I got from these first six verses of Psalm 19. Obviously, I think there's the reference that gets used in Romans, right? In Romans chapter 10, Paul, in his discussion of general revelation, of how the knowledge of God is available to all, he uses that the voice has gone out to all the earth and their words to the ends of the world as a way of showing that God's message has gone out to all of humankind. And that's a real strong indication of that idea of general revelation. So there's a very theological bent to this particular psalm as well. And I think of that then even it reminds me as we read that psalm and we read that sort of evidence for general revelation of God making himself known through the creation. It reminds me of the Belgic Confession, and in Article 2 of the Belgic Confession, it tells us the means by which we know God. We know him by two means, and first, we know him by the creation, preservation, and government of the universe, since that universe is before our eyes like a beautiful book in which all creatures, great and small, are like letters to make us ponder the invisible things of God, his eternal power and his divinity. All these things are enough to convict men and to leave them without excuse. And we really see that in this psalm, in Psalm 19. And of course, then Belgic Confession goes on to say, second, he makes himself known to us more openly by his holy and divine word, as much as we need in this life for his glory and for the salvation of his own. And even as that, gets into the ideas of special revelation, which are, not necessarily the specific context of Psalm 19, we again see that language in the Belgic Confession of how he makes himself known through his word as much as we need in this life for his glory and for the salvation of his own. And again, just making it very clear that the glory of God is so central to our very presence of who we are and who God's creation is. It's really there to bring forth the glory of God. And so even if we as humans sometimes stumble in telling the glory of God, the heavens still are telling the glory of God. I don't know if you've ever heard Franz Joseph Haydn's version of the heavens are telling the glory of God, but it's an amazing piece of music.
Oh, my friend, thank you for that. What a beautiful description. I've pulled up that Haydn's creation piece, and I actually have not heard of it, which is surprising because I'm pretty well versed in a lot of the standard classical repertoire, but this is new to me. So let me listen to it and enjoy it, my friend. Thank you for the suggestion and the recommendation.
Absolutely. I think it will become one of your favorites.
So there's one aspect of this, and Chuck, you and I talk privately sometimes about how to speak about sensitive or delicate topics with our listeners. And I think that this psalm brings up an excellent case study in trying to work through biblical topics in a wholesome and edifying way. And it's a long way of saying I talked about the two ways, the two examples that this text speaks about how the heavens declare the glory of God with joy. So, not just as an indifferent messenger, but delivering this message of God's glory in a joyful fashion, like a sun, like the sun delivers its light to all of the creation. And so, we talked about the strong man, and I mentioned the Eric Liddell quote. I wasn't able to find it. I did find one that I think might be related to it. And Eric says this. He says, I believe that God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure. And wow. So that to me is an embodiment of the second picture in here. But the first one is also, and this is where I've got to be careful because verse 4 and verse 5 speak about a very particular, beautiful, joyful human activity. So he has sent a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber. Now, I don't want to get into gory details here, but there's a particular image, let's just say, being evoked. What does it mean for a bridegroom leaving his chamber that has to do with the shining of the sun? And I want to be delicate here. This is a family show. But at the same point in time, I want to acknowledge that God has a way of telling us some of the most important things using some of the most, I'm searching for the right word here, some of the most carnal aspects or creaturely aspects of our existence. And without being blunt, let's just say that married couples have a very particular joy that they can experience the night of their wedding. And it's almost a meme, the face that two newlyweds have, the sort of shining light that comes out of their face after they've been together for their honeymoon. And that's the kind of joy that God says he endows in his creation, in the delivery of this message. Chuck, feel free to comment on that if you want to, but also I'd like to maybe just ask you to, would it be okay if you would read verses 7 to 11 after that?
Sure. Yeah, I noticed that in one of my study Bibles, the language there in talking about verse 5 is similar to the language that you just used, talking about like a bridegroom being resplendent and bursting with energy. And I think that's something that we can very much understand, that resplendent face that you described and the bursting with energy, and the same kind of joy that we have in experiencing God's greatness through his creation. We sometimes, if we were a bunch of seventh graders, we might giggle a little bit about the image. It is still a perfectly appropriate image and very expressive as to what is going on. Yeah, excellent. So verses 7 through 11 of Psalm 19. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The rules of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, even much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey and drippings of the honeycomb. Moreover, by them is your servant warned. In keeping them, there is great reward. And by the way, that what is really neat about then verses 7 through 11, just to build on some of the things we talked about before. Here is where we get the special revelation piece, isn't it? Where in verses 1 through 6, we see God revealing himself through creation. And now in verses 7 through 11, we see God revealing himself through his law, through his word, his perfect law. But it's a law that is not a harsh law, but it's a law that is perfect, that revives the soul and rejoices the heart and enlightens the eye, and it's more to be desired even than gold. So it's really neat how those two sections of the psalm work together so well.
Yeah, thank you for reading that. I would say this middle portion that you just read is perhaps one of the most important passages in all of the scriptures. And its importance lies in its emphasis. Now, in some sense, you and I have been studying some of the more modern forms of Christianity and even secular thought. For example, we've read together and studied pretty deeply into the 19th century philosophical movements, for example. And we've seen how in the Enlightenment, there's been movements in Christianity, particularly through theologians like, for example, Soren Kierkegaard, that have sought to locate the ultimate religious concept in the individual human self. And indeed, that's even why, in some sense, it's called the Enlightenment. And so this refers to the inner light of the human soul and its use. And so not only do we have Kierkegaard in this group, I would say we have theologians like D.F.E. Schleiermacher, Friedrich Schleiermacher, as well. This sort of develops into the movements of Kant and Hegel, and eventually becomes anti-religious, let's say, in the young Hegelians and the movements that come from that section. But even just thinking about the Christian movements that came out of the 19th century through the movements of Kierkegaard, through the movements of Schleiermacher and some others, we can think of classical liberalism here. So there's a lot of names that we could go through. But the idea that I hear so often from such speakers is this idea that it is this inner light that you and I can access and look into. You can look deep inside of yourself, Chuck, and you can find God there. You can find ultimate truth there. And we might even think from reading verses 1 to 6 that we have some support for that. If the heavens are declaring the glory of God and the firmament is showing his handiwork, well, in some sense, then we are receptacles, or we receive these broadcasts. And so this inner light is where we should look to find the ultimate truths about who God is, what he's like, who we are, and how we relate to him. But this psalm keeps us from doing that, because in verses 7 through 11, which you've read so beautifully, the psalm offers something even better than the inner human light. And I'm just going to go and reread these couplets, these beautiful couplets about the Holy Scriptures themselves. And starting in verse 7, the law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eye. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The rules of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. And so what we see is these couplings of the goodness of the law of the Lord, the testimony of the Lord, the precepts of the Lord, the commandment of the Lord, the fear of the Lord, the rules of the Lord. And by these, we're all rooted in God's revelation. So not only the declared general revelation that comes through the natural creation, such as the way the sun shines on reality, but on top of that, we as humans, as people, we have these beautiful scriptures. And what do these scriptures do? Rather than us looking inside of ourselves to find this inner ultimate truth, rather, the psalm commends looking to these beautiful laws and testimonies and precepts that are found in these holy scriptures. And so the conclusion is, what more to be desired are they than gold, and sweeter also than honey. Wow. And so the fruits of modernity, in some sense, look like a declension to me. Chuck, why would I look inside of myself for this inner light when I have something better? Testimony of the scriptures. And so we see that's the pinch point of the challenge of modernity. So modernity and postmodernity, these phenomenological thinkers, come to us and say some variation, even within Christian circles. Yes, the Bible is good, but ultimately look inside of yourself to see what is ultimately pure and true and right. But we have something better to hang our hats on, and that is this external law of the Lord, this given revelation, this special revelation that we have. And because of that, I think that's where we have all of these theological movements that you and I were studying. So these ideas of, for example, the third way of Barth, also related to the other liberals that came out of the continental tradition. And this idea of using, for example, psychology to look inside, to understand, to learn, to measure, to evaluate. You are your standard. But then what can you and I say in response to that? I think Proverbs 3 says it, not on your own understanding, but in all things acknowledge God's way, and he will make our paths straight. So that's, for me, one of the most seminal texts in all of the scriptures is here in Psalm 19. Now, how does this part fit with that in your thinking, and how do you see this lay out in this broad struggle between these different worldviews?